In the corner where the divan met the wall sat a wondrous and venerable figure, crowned with the felt headdress of the kind called Taj, round the base of which was wound a small white turban. The face of him on whom I gazed, I can never forget, though I cannot describe it. Those piercing eyes seemed to read one's very soul. Power and authority sat on that ample brow. No need to ask in whose presence I stood, as I bowed myself before one who is the object of a devotion and love which kings might envy and emperors sigh for in vain. A mild, dignified voice bade me be seated, and then continued. Yet so it shall be. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come. Thus did Edward Browne of Cambridge describe his meeting with Baha'u'llah at his Baha'i residence in 1890, which took some 2 years before Baha'u'llah's passing. Baha'u'llah, how can I describe him except in his own majestic prose? I'm the son of wisdom and the ocean of knowledge. I cheer the faint and revive the dead. I'm the guiding light that illuminates the way. I'm the royal falcon on the arm of the Almighty. I unfold the drooping wings of every broken bird and start it on its flight. Here we have Baha'u'llah articulating world peace, the crowning jewel of his cause. Welcome everyone to this presentation entitled Drawing Nigh to Baha'u'llah, a Baha'i alternative to international relations theory. What I aim to show here is how a Baha'i discourse on international relations can provide a timely, a comprehensive, and above all, viable alternative to the principal theory informing international relations, namely political realism. What I aim to show is, or to demonstrate how, or to unpack the Baha'i prerequisites for peace, in the process mapping out the contours of a new world order upon which such a peace can be realized and sustained. And so, by drawing on the work of Baha'u'llah himself, in addition to the works of ʻAbdu'l-Bahá, Shoghi Effendi, and the Universal House of Justice, I will show how the Baha'i approach, the Baha'i discourse on global politics can realize an all-inclusive, lasting global peace, which, according to Baha'u'llah, the like of which no mortal eye had ever conceived. But before doing so, I want to go over the principal theory within international relations studies. When we speak about foreign policy, foreign relations, international diplomacy, it is the kind of knowledge that is disseminated by the realist school of thought that informs world politics. And it is precisely by going over the realist school of thought, the realist theory or the realist discourse, that we can have an insight into how world relations at present unfold, and by implication, the kind of international order upon which such practices are based. You'll notice that I'll be going over the two interrelated concepts of theory and discourse when referencing realism, and then later the Baha'i approach. I referenced the Baha'i discourse on global politics. And I want to take a moment and briefly explain what is meant by these two key concepts, theory and discourse. By theory, we mean a kind of a simplifying device which tells us what facts matter and what do not, in this case about understanding international relations and world politics. And so here by a theory, we mean a kind of knowledge that is produced and disseminated. What is important and what is not. At the same time, each theory is replete by certain leading buzzwords that convey information and knowledge about an object of analysis. In this case, for example, international relations. And we understand discourse as much the same thing. Think about discourse as a mode of narrative, a mode of storytelling about some object of analysis. For example, global politics. So when we speak about discourse, we mean a mode of articulating knowledge, a mode of articulating reality. We mean discourse as a group of signs and statements, a combination of what has been said and written about a subject of analysis, global relations, for example. And so each discourse is replete by certain buzzwords, watchwords, keywords, or concepts that together define the boundaries of what can be thought of and explained, in this case, about global politics. So when we speak about realism as a theory or discourse about global politics, we're talking about the oldest and the most influential theory about global politics. Understanding state relations, for example, international diplomacy, foreign policy, is impossible without understanding realism and the kind of knowledge that it promotes in the world of practice. Hence, we say that theory is, in the real sense of the term, practice, just like discourse is practice, because they permeate certain knowledges that manifest themselves in the world of practice, foreign policy practice. And so, realism, its genealogy goes back to the work of certain classical scholars. Niccolo Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes are two notable examples. And whenever time is right, I will speak about their contribution to the realist discourse and, by implication, international relations. But perhaps the two have contributed to this classical tradition in international relations, Machiavelli and Hobbes, to this thing that we call statism, which is the cornerstone of the realist approach, the realist discourse to global politics. One of the chief buzzwords here is statism. By statism, it's meant a kind of organization of humankind into particular political communities, the values of which are protected by the state. So in here, we're talking about states, in particular sovereign states, as the main actors in global relations, in global politics. And when we say states as the main actors, it's because the states are privileged here. They're understood as the primary unit, main actor, chief subject of analysis, at the expense of individuals and international institutions. It simply means that humanity, individuals, peoples of the world matter so far as they represent their respective states, not the other way around, you see? And the principle of sovereignty, this thing that we call state sovereignty, is the chief component, the sine qua non for relations among states. State sovereignty is also a part and parcel, a component of the present-day international legal order. By sovereignty, we mean a supreme authority within a given territory. For example, the United Nations recognizes 195 sovereign states, 193 of which are permanent member states, and there are two so-called non-permanent observer states, the Vatican City and the State of Palestine, you see. But by sovereignty, we mean something of a politically sacred contract among discrete political units, in this case states, that have monopoly over several things. For example, monopoly over taxing their populations, maintain armaments. And the most important of all, the monopoly over the use of force, which means that here we're talking about states and their respective rulers as having monopoly to wage warfare. That is given to the state. And it is all under the banner of this thing that we call exclusive authority, which is a chief norm or principle of the present-day international legal order, and by implication, international law. And so here with the sovereign state also, we also mean a situation wherein the state has the exclusive authority, ultimate right, to tap into their territory's resources, natural and otherwise, you see? And so the conception, so important, is this category of state as the main actor in international relations, that even the understanding of the world order we have is predicated upon the notion of statehood. In other words, the view of the world order to which we have fallen here is, so goes the argument, must be defined by the conception of statehood. And perhaps the best manifestation of my claim here is Hadley Bowl, one of the leading theorists in international relations studies. In his seminal work, it's called The Anarchical Society, a study of order in global politics. He defines the concept of world order. He defines it as a pattern of activity that sustains the elementary or primary goals of the society of states. So even with the definition of global order, we have the state as the chief subject and object of analysis, a pattern of activity that sustains the elementary or primary goals of the society of states. When we speak about a patterning, we mean an arrangement, a kind of a design, usually a repeated design. And that design or arrangement defines the primary goals of the state. And we are next into understanding what are some of those primary or elementary goals of the society of state operating at the global level. And hence here the analysis of theory and discourse comes into play. Because depending on which you take up, you end up with certain key buzzwords or concepts. Think about concepts as ideas or a set of ideas that we have created in order to explain the social world, because without understanding them, without those concepts, understanding the social world is a daunting task. And perhaps the key buzzword, the key concept in the realist theory of global politics is anarchy. Anarchy. With anarchy, we mean basically the absence of a higher authority. Because we have theorized that the concept of state sovereignty can only be applied to the state. Beyond the state level, that is to say, at the global level, there is a condition of anarchy, a kind of a morality-free zone, wherein a condition of a war of everyone against everybody else prevails. The idea goes back to Thomas Hobbes and what he called state of nature. It simply means kind of a condition where a war of everyone against everybody else prevails. So we're talking about states operating in that kind of a morality-free zone, wherein basically anything goes. And so in the absence of a supreme authority, a supreme sovereign authority, then we are left with a kind of uncertain environment so far as the relationship among states are concerned, or is concerned, wherein there is no way to settle disputes, coordinate state relations, enforce laws, or even mitigate wars. So that kind of a condition. And because, and bear in mind that when we speak about anarchy, we're talking about the fundamental fact of international relations. When it is, or to the point that it is called a fact, means that anarchy as a condition cannot be transcended. It cannot be remedied. It is a fact. And so there are several ways in which anarchy is understood in global relations. For some, it's a rule. For others, it's a condition. It's a principle. So there are invariably, if anarchy is invariably referenced differently. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a condition and a rule. So in the an environment of uncertainty, when anarchy prevails, so goes the argument, a principle that is called self-help prevails. A self-help mentality, if you wish. By self-help, we mean a condition where in an environment in which anything goes, those states who do not help themselves end up suffering, meaning they cease to exist. And so because self-help is the prevailing mentality here, of course, in a condition of anarchy, then states must do everything they can in order to serve their self-interest. So safeguarding and advancing states' self-interest becomes the overriding imperative here. So a kind of a cult of self-interest prevails, wherein we can only define interest in the context of self-interest, or national interest, or state interest, you see? And in this environment of self-help and uncertainty, then because anarchy is the rule, survival becomes the state's chief priority. Survival becomes the chief priority in the sense that survival trumps all other obligations. The argument is that what good, for example, is prosperity? What good is development if you cannot survive the system? So there are two things here. Self-interest, or this cult of self-interest, or state interest, or national interest prevails. Think about the slogan, America First, for example. It's a manifestation of that mentality, that self-help mentality. It might have been widespread because it has become a matter of governmental policy as such. But it's a prevailing idea that permeates all state relations. For example, you do not see a government in South America vouching for a government in North America, and vice versa. So it is an accepted norm and mentality here. And the second one is that because anarchy is the rule, and because survival becomes the chief priority of the state, then you are left with a condition that is about states operating in a perpetual survival mode. And hence you have John Mearsheimer here. States must remain vigilant. And American political realists and the founder of this realist subset in global politics that we call offensive realism. States still active to this day. States must remain vigilant. and never subordinate survival to any other goal, including prosperity. Look no further than the action of North Korea, for example. The population is starving, but the North Korean government, the North Korean state, is increasing the awesome might of its nuclear weapons. In order to understand where the prescription comes from, look no further than realism. And so the question at this point becomes how to survive. Part of it was about serving the self-interest, national interest, or state interest, or the national interest of the state. But because you are in a perpetual survival mode, it is at this juncture that power becomes the most important power resource in global politics, or I should say power becomes the most important resource in global politics in a condition of uncertainty and where the state's chief preoccupation is to survive. So think about power or power struggle, as realists refer to it, as a kind of biological imperative that is about this universal urge to survive. And it is at this point that power trumps all other considerations. And power is understood here in a relative context. It is always understood in relation to the action of the other state, who is also bent on a survival mode to survive before prospering. So here, power will not be granted to you. You must actively seek power. And so power is always acquired at somebody else's expense. And because survival is the overriding imperative, military power becomes the most important power resource in global politics. The most important power resource is the military power. Again, looking back at the previous year, 2024, to see how the manifestation of this would be in the world of practice. The world spent a record high on military expenditures. The official name for it is money spent on defense. We never call it offense. It's always defense. In the excess of $2.7 trillion. Mind-boggling. And as the most important power resource, military power, at the top here we have the United States spending in 2024 some $997 billion on defense, almost $1 trillion. Next, China, $314 billion, and Russia, and so forth. So again, in order to see why such enormous amount is spent on military and militarism, look no further than the theoretical prescription here. I mean, the enormous energy wasted and dissipated not just on war, on prepping for war in this context is just, again, mind-boggling. And so it all comes back to the point that here, the ultimate aim, take a look at what Mersheimer is telling us, is to gain a position of dominant power. Because having dominant power, in this case, military power, will ensure survival. He also wrote, in the anarchic world of international relations, it is best to be Godzilla than Bambi, which speaks to the primacy of military power in today's world, and speak to this perpetual struggle for survival, as we call it. This perpetual, like an endless preoccupation, an endless struggle for survival. Statism, which is also a key component of realism. So far we have spoken about several key concepts informing the realist theory, the realist discourse on global politics. Anarchy is there. Think about it as the overarching concept because everything else emanates from anarchy. Sovereignty is one that I spoke about. Survival, another one. Power as this thing that merely dominates and exploits, another one. And here we're getting to the next chief buzzword in the realist school of thought. Statism, a component of realism, makes possible a nation-centric view of the world by legitimizing the discourse on nationalism, that most prevailing ideology of the modern state. Here, we're talking about nation becoming the most fundamental aspect comprising human life. In other words, nation becomes the basis for understanding the world, who we are, and by and large, our identity. And so, two things that we can say about nationalism as it's understood in the realist school of thought. One is that nationalism is all about the sovereignty of the state. To the extent that in international politics, national interest is always equated with state interest, and vice versa. And the second one, the discourse on nationalism provides the necessary response for the thorny issue of political identity by telling us who we are, or by pointing out who we are not and who we must not be and who to fear. And that who to fear and who we must not be always falls outside of our nation, outside of our territory. So a system of us versus them is sanctioned here. And in this sense, nationalism becomes a force amplifier or a force galvanizer because it gives the state the ideological permit. After all, we're talking about nationalism as an ism. A kind of an ideology that is about exaltation of one privileged race, one privileged nation over all others, you see? So it gives the state the ideological permit and the undisputed legal authority, because at the end of the day, it's the sovereign state. And the concept of sovereignty is an important component, principal component of international law. So it gives the state also the undisputed legal authority to extract significant resources and manpower in order to wage total wars with each other in the name of preserving the identity of the state, the DNA of the state, and the national interest of the state. And so, coming back to realism and recapping how it sees the categories of war and peace. Most certainly here, the analytical, theoretical category of war has been privileged as a matter of states' foreign policy practice to the detriment of a lasting global peace. That's one thing that we can say about realism. So in other words, this theory is about putting on a gloomy lens of the world. And because you end up putting up that gloomy lens, all you get in the milieu that is foreign policy practice is also that gloomy view of the world. But beyond the critique, it also remains a fact that realism so finely shows all that is wrong with the contemporary prescriptions for understanding notions of war and peace. It tells us precisely what is wrong and what is missed, so far as the category of warfare in particular is concerned. Take a look at some of the quotations I have put together, where some of the leading realist scholars are articulating the concept of war and peace. A chief among them, a luminary among them, is Kenneth Waltz. Kenneth Waltz is, he passed away a few short years ago, 2013. And one of the most celebrated luminaries within the realist camp. One of his major books Theory of International Politics, is the most assigned textbook to graduate students studying international relations across US universities. So, and a scholar of that stature we're speaking about. With many sovereign states, with no system of law enforceable among them, conflict leading to war is bound to occur. So beyond the critique, there also remains a truth in what Waltz is telling us here, that you have the sovereign states and you have the sovereign states operating in a morality-free zone, in a condition of anarchy. And so long as there are sovereign states having monopoly over the use of force, this quotation implies, so far as there is no supreme sovereign authority that operates above and beyond the state, conflict leading to war is bound to occur. Second one, Waltz is also telling us that war occurs because there is nothing to prevent it. So again, the condition of anarchy is brought to fore here. That because there is an absence of a higher authority beyond the state, preventing war is rather a pipe dream. The locus, Waltz still continues, the locus of the important causes of war is found in the nature and behavior of man. The locus of the important causes of war is found in the nature and behavior of men. This speaks to the idea of human nature that the realists take up. And the argument here is that states very much exhibit the same characteristics that we as human beings also exhibit. And the conception of human nature, according to the realists, much of it goes back to Machiavelli and Hobbes. We are inherently self-interested, nasty, brutish, egoistic, and driven by greed, a perpetual type of greed. And so this is who we are, and by implication, this is who the states are, because there is a liking of human beings to the state and the states to human beings. So here, Waltz is telling you that the important cause of war is found in the way in which human nature is theorized. And so at this point, the inevitable is achieved, and you have Mersheimer pitching in, kind of putting forth a kind of a prophecy for us, that the cycle of violence will continue not just into the new millennium, but far into the new millennium. And the fact that we're left with this, that peace and prosperity will not be realized. So that's where we end up so far as theorizing about global politics is concerned. And so it is basically at the conjunction of war, raw power, anarchy, and human nature, and I should also add statism and nationalism. It is at that conjuncture where the Baha'i discourse on global politics enters the debate and really intervenes as a counter discourse to the realist school of thought in global politics. And the analytical point of departure for the so-called Baha'i discourse problematization of global politics lies in this concept of nationalism. Because according to the Baha'i discourse, nationalism legitimizes the classification of humanity into discrete political communities that end up feeling themselves different from one another. In this sense, difference becomes the essence of and framework for understanding international relations. It is never about unity or diversity, or as the case may be, unity in diversity. One of the key or chief buzzwords or watchwords in the Baha'i discourse. And there are two other critiques that the Baha'i discourse on global politics also formulates and advances against or as a counter discourse to realism. One is that this formulation embedded in nationalism gives rise, according to the Baha'i discourse, to categorical binaries, fatherlands, motherlands, against or versus foreign lands, strange lands, inside races versus outside races, inside ethnicities, languages, and religions versus the subordinate ones, and the political loyalties that these categories generate and demand. It is these prejudices that continue to shake the limbs of humanity, and so long as they exist, so shall conflict, war, and misery. And so in the Baha'i discourse, the eradication of prejudices of all types and kinds becomes a prerequisite for establishing world peace. And so in here, the Baha'i discourse argues that this exclusionary, politicized project of difference-making embedded in nationalism sanctions racial animosity and patriotic prejudices at the expense of the healing, the saving, and the pregnant truth that is the concept or principle of oneness of humankind. You know, not so long ago, in 1959, Kenneth Waltz, I spoke about him. In one of his major works, it's called Man, the State, and War. He told us something that is quite crucial for understanding Baha'u'llah's conception of oneness of humankind. 1959, it was only 2 years after the passing of Shoghi Effendi, in order to give you the context of the time. He wrote, if we are to have peace, Waltz wrote, if we are to have peace, we must give loyalty to a larger group. We must give loyalty to a larger group. And before we learn to give loyalty to a larger group, the thing to which we are to be loyal must be created. And so we are here with Baha'u'llah's creation with a capital C in the concept of oneness of humankind. ʻAbdu'l-Bahá references the concept or the principle as the distinguishing feature of Baha'u'llah's law. Shoghi Effendi, the pivot round which all the teachings of Baha'u'llah revolve. The pivot round. Elsewhere in the world order of Baha'u'llah, Shoghi Effendi, the head cornerstone of Baha'u'llah's all-encompassing dominion, referencing the concept or principle of oneness of humankind. You see how important and central this value, this principle is to the Baha'i discourse, the Baha'i theory on global politics. And so it can be understood in several ways. On one level, we can understand the oneness of humankind as an overriding principle that dictates to us that humanity is one. And it is precisely via this empirical recognition that a viable mode of theorizing about international relations and global politics alike can be conceived. Think about it both as a roadmap as well as a response to an increasingly interconnected world in dire need of an agency to guarantee the political unity of its member states, a precondition for realizing an all-inclusive global peace, you see. At the same time, the concept understands the people of the earth and by implication their respective states as members of the same body, while acknowledging and recognizing that when one member is diminished, so are all. Why do I say this? I'm referencing Baha'u'llah here. Be ye as members or fingers of one hand, and the members of one body. You're the fruits of one tree, and the leaves of one branch. So it is about the international health of the body politics of the state. If one is ill, so are all, is the political implication of oneness of humankind as a so-called epistemology of knowledge. By that, we just simply mean as a theory of knowledge, as a device that tells us what facts about the world matter. And the fact that matters about world relations, international relations, is the one that humanity is one. And so the concept rejects as an ideal or a theory of knowledge. It rejects any form, any type of paternalism or prejudice, militaristic, cultural, economic, and otherwise, that stigmatizes the other as socially backward or politically immature. And where this concept or these concepts, socially backward and politically immature, are taken up and explained in relation to the value of oneness of humankind, the advent of divine justice is the place to go, written by Shoghi Effendi. The Baha'i discourse, or the Baha'i theory on international relations, also promotes an alternative conception of power to the realist school of thought. And the analytical point of departure here in the Baha'i discourse is that the realist school of thought's understanding of power as this thing that merely dominates and exploits must be left behind. And we have the Universal House of Justice speaking about or writing about power here. So power as this thing that creates division or enables superiority of certain nations, certain states over all others. That kind of a notion or that kind of conception or conceptualization of power is rejected in the Baha'i discourse on global politics. Here, in the Baha'i faith, the cause or the theory, as a theory, the cause does not reject the operation of power. It doesn't. In fact, it acknowledges that power and authority go hand in hand, as it inferred in the quote right here. And the cause also speaks about a conception of power that is about consent that people give or relegate to their representatives. So we're not rejecting the operation of power as such, but there is this entire facet to power that must be taken up and acknowledged and set in motion in foreign policy relations and international relations alike, as this thing that produces, as this thing that is enabling, as this thing that is emancipatory. So here, this positive connotation of power is something that the Baha'i discourse on global politics strive to tap into. When we say power as a positive entity, or a positive relation, or an enabling relation, we're talking about the capacity of power to produce, in particular to produce love and unity. Think about that. To produce love and unity. Here, we get to the philosophy of international relations. For so long, we have taken up the Machiavellian idea that if we are torn between love and fear, it is always safer to be feared than love. But in the Baha'i discourse, you see how it promotes an oppositional knowledge production to the realist discourse. In the Baha'i discourse, the foundation of peace is love, ʻAbdu'l-Bahá once wrote. The foundation of peace is love. And here, love is understood as the greatest power in the world of existence. You see? Because of its capacity to produce unity. So there is an interlinkage among these concepts, power, love, and unity. So for ʻAbdu'l-Bahá, again, the foundation of peace is love because love is the greatest power in the world of universe, he says. But it is also important, that kind of a stress on power, because of its capacity to produce unity, which is a precondition for a lasting, all-inclusive global peace in the Baha'i discourse. And so the power of unity is also taken up here. Baha'u'llah himself wrote, for example, that the well-being of mankind, its peace and security cannot be attained until its unity is firmly established. So it tells you how central is this concept of unity, and its subvariant, unity in diversity, is to this thing that we call security and peace, you see? But then again, we're talking about power of unity. Baha'u'llah again, so powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth. So unity creation is part of the political imperative or political task that power must perform beyond this thing that is merely understood as at present at this corrupt, brutal, and unrelenting entity. And we now get to this problematization of self, national, and state interest that the Baha'i discourse also promotes as a kind of knowledge or counter-knowledge against the realist school of thought. This concept of national interest, state interest, is first problematized and then rejected in the Baha'i theory on global politics. And perhaps the text we can refer to in order to see how the Baha'i theory on global politics problematizes and subsequently rejects this cult of self-interest, national interest, or state interest, is the ʻAbdu'l-Bahā's tablet on the struggle for survival. The tablet of Tanazu'e Baqa, the literal translation from Arabic, is the struggle for survival. I talked about this some minutes ago when I went over the realist school of thought and quoted John Mearsheimer, that here there is a perpetual strive to survive the system. And so here, ʻAbdu'l-Bahá is speaking to that discourse, that preoccupation with survival in the tablet on the struggle for survival. And here, ʻAbdu'l-Bahá speaks much like a philosopher of international relations. And the analytical departure point for ʻAbdu'l-Bahá here is that at present, he wrote, all the nations are thinking of how to advance their own self-interests while working against the best interests of other nations. They call this the struggle for survival and assert that it is innate to human nature. ʻAbdu'l-Bahá goes on to call it the greatest error. And I just want you to look at it side by side. I spoke about the fact that each discourse is replete by certain buzzwords. So here, if we read ʻAbdu'l-Bahá and Mearsheimer side by side, you see how ʻAbdu'l-Bahá is problematizing and rejecting this condition of struggle for survival. Mearsheimer, the ultimate aim is to gain a position of dominant power because having dominant power ensures survival or ensures one's own survival. ʻAbdu'l-Bahá, for he then, and he's speaking about, ʻAbdu'l-Bahá, he's here speaking about the statement or the state. He uses that subject interchangeably in the tablet on the struggle for survival. Sometimes the reference point is the state or the ruler. Sometimes the reference point is the nation and the state. So for he then exerts the utmost effort to bring all the advantages of human world to his own nation and imagines that the more other nations decline, the more his own country and nation will advance, until by this means it surpasses and dominates the other nations in power. You see? So in direct debunking of what Mearsheimer is saying here. And ʻAbdu'l-Bahá then gives us a logic and a reason as to why he is rejecting this cult of self-interest or national interest. At the governmental or state level, he reasons this mentality will end up leading to a zero-sum situation, a zero-sum game that the realists glorify. It simply means that my gain equals your loss. And this mentality, ʻAbdu'l-Bahá postulates, will end up causing injury to other nations, because the power that is behind it is always acquired at somebody else's expense. And so this limited aspiration is narrow, according to the Baha'i discourse. It's confined. It is inward-looking, and above all, jarringly out of step with the reality of the world, the vision of Baha'u'llah, and the prerequisites for peace. What is the vision here? Let your vision be world-embracing, rather than confined to your own self, Baha'u'llah wrote. And so, a clear debunking of realism, as I mentioned, in the tablet on the struggle for survival. See, what else ʻAbdu'l-Bahá is telling us? The injury of any nation or state must be the same as the injury to his own nation and other state. Indeed, an injury to your own self, he's saying. So thoughts must expand to that level. Actions, policy must expand to that level if we are to have peace. And you have to, ʻAbdu'l-Bahá says, there is no alternative. When you read the Baha'i discourse on what to do with this idea or this cult of self, there is no alternative but to think about the well-being of the entire human race and the entire humanity. That's the alternative here. So in The Promised Days Come, Shoghi Effendi problematizes this view of realism on the notion of self and the cult of self-interest. The Guardian wrote, contrasting with and irrevocably opposed to these world-engendering, these world-convulsing phenomena are the healing, the saving, and the pregnant truths proclaimed by Baha'u'llah, the divine organizer and savior of the entire human race. Truths which should be regarded as the animating force and the hallmark of his revelation. And then the Guardian continues to start quoting Baha'u'llah. The world is but one country and mankind its citizens, he then wrote. Let not a man glory in that he loves his country. Let him rather glory in this, that he loves his kind. And again, you're the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. Be ye as fingers of the same hand and the members of the same body. And yet again, that one indeed is a man who today dedicates himself to the service of the entire human race. You see? So here, to achieve this lofty station, thoughts and actions must undergo transformation. And the Baha'i discourse on global politics tells us that this is achievable. It can be achieved. And when I say thoughts and actions must undergo transformation, it is also speaking to the Baha'i take on human nature. You know, the Baha'i discourse on international relations, when you go over how it unpacks the concept of human nature, it treats it with maximum complexity. Beyond this mere understanding of human beings as good or bad, in this case as nasty, brutish, and self-interested, as the realists take it up. To be sure, the Baha'i faith understands that there is that aspect to us. For example, when once ʻAbdu'l-Bahá was writing about war and really what we have done to each other as a human species, historically, he wrote how darkened and savage are the instincts of humanity. But he also gives us something else to think about, in that all human beings possess two nature, according to him, one lower nature and the upper nature, the higher nature. With the higher nature is the capacity to produce unity, to love, to think about harmony and peace, so forth. But there is also this lower nature that has to do with lust, with self-interest, with egoism, and with greed. And so here, the missing link is education. Education is critical to bring into light that lower nature of us, to transcend it. Otherwise, it is acknowledged here that humanity possesses both natures. For example, Baha'u'llah himself, he wrote, "Man is the supreme talisman," he wrote. "Through admonition and explanation, good counsel and education, its higher nature can come to light." Or else what he wrote, regard man as a mind rich in gems of inestimable value. Education alone can cause it to reveal its treasure and benefit mankind therefrom. And so hence, the Baha'i system of education comes into play in order for thoughts and actions to be transformed. You know, and Baha'i system of education, a form of compulsory education that is about, for example, on one level, the Baha'i discourse promotes a kind of knowledge that is about creating educational institutions that teaches primarily the oneness of humankind, schools dedicated exclusively to peace studies, for example. That kind of a system of global education. So mind, thoughts, and actions can transform. In one of his major works, the Revelation of Baha'u'llah, he called it. Former member of the Universal House of Justice, Adib Taherzadeh, also speaks about it. Human society at present, Taherzadeh wrote, exerts a pernicious influence on the soul and mind of the individual, instead of allowing us to live a life of sacrifice to humanity, to the human race, service to humanity and to human race. It is excessively competitive and teaches us to develop our egos, talking about this cult of self-interest. From an early age, we are taught to seek to exalt ourselves above others. The ultimate aim, according to Taherzadeh, is to achieve self-importance, fame, and power. The revelation of Baha'u'llah aims to reverse this process. The soul of man must be adorned by virtues of humility, self-effacement, he wrote, so that we might be detached from the kingdom of names. And so ultimately, when I say that according to the Baha'i discourse, transforming thoughts and actions is a reality and a possibility, I'm also referencing ʻAbdu'l-Bahá here. He once wrote, every imperfect soul, speaking about achieving that station, and it is achievable. He wrote, take a look at how mind can be transferred in order to get there. Every human being is self-centered and only thinks about his own self-interest, he wrote. But as his thoughts expand a little, he will begin to think about the welfare of his family. Yet as thoughts and ideas widen, he will begin to think about the welfare and felicity of his fellow citizens and of his land. But when thoughts reach the utmost degree of expansion, he will be thinking about the exaltation of all humanity and all lands. This is, ʻAbdu'l-Bahá concluded, indicative of perfection. And beyond the philosophy of international relations, we now get to the institutional/governmental covenant of Baha'u'llah. And the place that this has been best articulated in the Baha'i discourse is in Shoghi Effendi's World Order of Baha'u'llah. And this statement is key to see how Baha'u'llah ends up creating a new world order capable of sustaining a lasting, all-inclusive global peace. Shoghi Effendi wrote, nation building has come to an end. Nation building has come to an end. So nationalism rejected. The anarchy inherent in state sovereignty is moving toward a climax. A world growing to maturity must abandon this fetish. So one by one, nationalism, as the key concept in the realist school of thought, rejected. It's actually a force amplifier, a causer of conflict. Anarchy, rejected. Sovereignty, rejected. So you can imagine what is to come. It's a world order that is no longer state-centric. And with the nation building has come to an end, let me clarify this. In the Baha'i theory on global politics, it is the idea that the unity of family, of tribe, of city-state, of nation has been successfully attempted and fully established. Now, world unity is the goal toward which a harassed humanity is striving. On the question of anarchy, in the Baha'i World Congress in 1963 in London, William Sears, speaking to the audience, said something quite intriguing. Clever as we are, said Sears, we cannot create a political penicillin to eliminate this fever of anarchy, strife, hate, and division. Sears' point is quite apt, indeed timely. Although able to convert mere atoms into agents of immense destruction, land on the moon, and travel faster than the speed of sound, we have been unable to rein in the condition of anarchy, the condition that we ourselves have created. But what I want to show here is that it is only through Baha'u'llah's prophetic vision, his prophetic pen, that we can eradicate the fever of anarchy, strife, and division. Baha'u'llah argues on behalf of the creation of a world commonwealth, a world federal system, something of a super state. And that world commonwealth will end up ruling the entire world and exercising unchallengeable authorities over its resources. So the kind of world order that Baha'u'llah is advancing here no longer sees the sovereign state as the ultimate authority with exclusive rights over their territory's resources. It does not repudiate the system that Baha'u'llah advances. The system of national autonomy that is to be kept and is so crucial if excessive evil of centralization is to be avoided. And the Guardian wrote about it. So the system of national autonomy will continue to exist. It is just that the idea of absolute sovereign state will no longer exist, in that sovereignty is no longer absolute, or the absolute principle, as the realist school of thought preaches. No longer absolute in that the states under Baha'u'llah's world order no longer have the right to maintain armament as they do now. They will have to cede every right to make war. At present, that right is the exclusive authority of the sovereign state that wages war according to international law as a monopoly. No longer there. The state must also relinquish certain rights to impose taxation. So no longer the exclusive domain of the sovereign state. And all rights to maintain armaments. No longer the exclusive domain of the sovereign state. So the idea of absolute sovereignty no longer exists. The states must relinquish their ultimate sovereign right to the Commonwealth. Continuing with Baha'u'llah's world order, a world legislature will be created with the express purpose of creating laws. A system of universal election will be created. Respective governments, respective states will have candidates, and elections are created at the state level. It is actually, it has to be ratified by respective governments. And those delegates will end up comprising that world legislature. And that world legislature have ultimate authority, its members have ultimate authorities over the resources of the world. Redistribution, access, and otherwise. They must constitute the trustees of the world, according to Shoghi Effendi. Think about the Gandhis of the day, the Thich Nhat Hanhs of the day, the Mary Maxwells of the day, the Ruhiya Khanums of the day, the J.N. Tickners of the day, the Shireen Ebadis of the day, comprising that world legislature. A world executive will also be created. Exclusive responsibility is to ensure that those laws are enacted. You see, with every one of them, there is a remedy for anarchy. When we spoke about anarchy, it's a jungle-like environment. It's a morality-free zone, after all, because there is no supreme sovereign authority to enact laws, settle disputes, or coordinate state relations. Baha'u'llah has thought about it every step of the way. A world executive is created. Job, ensure to enforce laws. And that executive is backed by an international force. And by implication, a system of collective security here is created. Think about a global NATO that will be created. A global NATO that is no longer ideological. You see? And in its seminal work, The Promise of World Peace, published in 1985, the Universal House of Justice spends some systematic or gives some systematic attention to this system of collective security, a global-like NATO, that every state will be protected no matter what size they have. Because its membership is not based on might, the House of Justice wrote, but on justice. If I have to unpack what justice means here, part of it is subscription to the worldwide law of Baha'u'llah, right here, ceding every right to make war, certain rights to impose taxations, and all rights to maintain armaments. At that point, you're a member of the Commonwealth. And your right, your existence will be protected no matter what by the international force. And that's the assurance you're getting by including yourself in the system. And so when one aggressor rises, all will unite against it. Again, here, we're not repudiating the system of national autonomy here, but national imperative, national autonomy, the national interests are subordinated to the imperative of a unified world. And a world tribunal will be created to settle disputes among states with unparalleled authority. Its decisions are final, again, comprised of the trustees of the world. It will not be a kind of subscription to the Western ideals or Eastern ideals. It is predicated upon the value of the oneness of humankind, that humanity is one, no matter your race, your gender, your ethnicity, and so forth. And so, I spoke about Hadley Bowl and his description of world order, his definition, a pattern of activity, he wrote, that sustains the primary or elementary relationship of the society of states. After speaking about this global commonwealth and its various organisms, in the world order of Baha'u'llah, Shoghi Effendi wrote, these institutions are, and I'm quoting him here, the pattern for a future society, the supreme instrument for the creation of the most great peace, and the one agency for the unification of the world. So by definition, Baha'u'llah's world order is no longer state-centric. And according to his prophetic vision, that understanding of the world, that world order that he envisioned, is bound to occur. It will just be a matter of time. But also the Baha'i texts give us a gloomy picture of how that world order might come about. In the world order of Baha'u'llah, Shoghi Effendi articulates this stance by referencing the closing passages from Baha'u'llah's seminal Hidden Words. He wrote, the prophetic voice of Baha'u'llah warning in the concluding passages of the Hidden Words to the peoples of the world that an unforeseen calamity is following them and that grievous retribution awaits them, throws indeed, according to Shoghi Effendi, a lurid light upon the immediate fortunes of sorrowing humanity. Nothing but a fiery ordeal out of which humanity will emerge, chastened and prepared, can succeed in implanting that sense of responsibility which the leaders of a newborn age must arise to shoulder. I would direct your attention to those ominous words of Baha'u'llah. And when the appointed hour is come, there shall suddenly appear that which shall cause the limbs of mankind to quake.